All right, let's jump right in. Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating text that takes a very ancient legal framework and applies it directly to one of the most intensely debated global topics out there right now, the US-Israel alliance. We're going to look strictly at the source material here. The author argues that when we evaluate these massive historic partnerships, we really need to take a hard look at the underlying logic people use to try and tear them down.
Because the text tackles this exact, towering question: how do we judge the morality and viability of global alliances? I mean, it's a huge question, right? How do we decide if these partnerships are fundamentally good or fundamentally broken? Well, the source material suggests that critics of these historic partnerships, specifically the US-Israel alliance, often lean heavily on emotional arguments rather than rigorous structural logic when demanding that we dismantle them. Basically, the author frames this as asking the wrong questions, or at least using the wrong formula to get the answers.
So, to map out the author's argument, we're structuring this explainer like a legal brief. We'll cross-examine the rhetoric in 5 methodical steps. First, the core legal principle. Second, the logical leap. Third, the Utopian Standard. Fourth, the prosecutor's trick. And finally, the systemic fallout.
All right, step 1, the core legal principle, or applying ancient law to modern geopolitics. The author's whole analysis anchors on something called Blackstone's ratio. Now, in criminal law, this is an absolute bedrock concept of justice. It's the idea that it is far better that 10 guilty persons escape than that one innocent suffer. But here's where it gets interesting. The author takes this deeply personal concept of justice and scales it all the way up to structural frameworks. The premise is that you just can't condemn an entire massive system because some guilty elements exist within it, especially if dismantling that entire system would cause immense innocent suffering on a global scale.
Moving on to step 2, the logical leap, which is all about conflating individual malfeasance with structural illegitimacy.
So, the source text points out that critics, whether they're from the America First camp or anti-Zionist groups, often build their cases on highly localized grievances. We're talking about things like specific policy failures, ethical lapses by individual politicians, or profiteering within the defense contracting ecosystem. And look, the text fully acknowledges these are real issues, but it highlights that critics use them as undeniable evidence against the alliance as a whole. And that right there illustrates the core trap. The text argues that by fixating on those specific grievances, critics are falling straight into the fallacy of composition. That's a logical error where you assume what's true of a specific part is automatically true for the entire whole. It's kind of like demanding we outlaw the entire concept of the automobile just because your car got a flat tire, you know? You wouldn't throw the whole car in the trash over a puncture. The author argues that judging a multi-decade geopolitical structure based on isolated bad actors is a massive flaw in reasoning.
The text draws a really brutal contrast here. On one side, you have the actual evidence being offered: isolated infractions by politicians, maybe corporate lobbying abuses, or military overreach. But then on the other side, you have the leap in logic, taking that localized evidence and using it to condemn the entire strategic defense framework as inherently evil. Under the framework of Blackstone's ratio, demanding the abolition of a massive governmental system just because individual actors abuse it, the author presents that as a leap way too far.
This brings us to step 3, the Utopian Standard, where we look at inverting the risk and demanding perfection.
The text makes a super interesting observation here. It asserts that holding the US-Israel partnership to a standard of utopian perfection completely ignores the reality of systemic corruption everywhere else. I mean, think about it. If we actually applied this logic, if the mere presence of corrupt politicians or a military-industrial complex automatically invalidates a foreign alliance, then the United States would have to sever diplomatic and strategic ties with virtually every nation on Earth, even our closest European allies. The point is, no domestic agency or international alliance can pass a test of absolute, flawless perfection. And when we compare the cost of this proposed remedy against the status quo, the author reveals a massive asymmetry. Sure, the status quo means tolerating occasional bad actors and localized profiteering. It's definitely not perfect. But look at the cost of the remedy. It doesn't magically eliminate global corruption. Instead, it dissolves vital intelligence sharing networks and creates a highly volatile power vacuum. And according to the text, that vacuum is almost always filled by regimes with far worse records on human rights. So the analysis concludes that the remedy is actually far more destructive than the disease.
Okay, step 4. The prosecutor's trick, or misallocating the burden of proof.
According to the source material, critics tend to follow these 3 steps to kind of bypass logic. First, they highlight very real-world grievances, like the absolute tragedy of civilian casualties. Second, They weaponize these emotional and moral realities. And third, by leaning so heavily on the emotional weight of those realities, they completely bypass the rigorous burden of proof that is actually required to dismantle a massive geopolitical system. The author calls this the prosecutor's trick, using an emotional shortcut to demand structural collapse without proving the structure itself is the root problem.
So what's the actual requirement here? Well, the text insists that instead of taking those emotional shortcuts, critics have a very specific obligation. The true burden of proof requires them to prove that the overarching architecture of the alliance itself is a net detriment to security when compared to the alternative. Just pointing out that bad actors exist doesn't meet that burden. You literally have to prove that tearing down the house is safer than just fixing the roof.
Which leads us to our final step, Section 5, the systemic fallout and the massive risk of a geopolitical reset. The text issues a really severe warning here. It says that if we treat a foundational alliance like an irredeemable criminal, we guarantee a reckless geopolitical reset. The fallout from that includes the catastrophic destruction of cooperative architectures, totally escalated global instability, and volatile power vacuums filled by much worse actors. The author is warning that advocating for such a destructive remedy far outweighs the localized grievances the critics claim to be solving. You're essentially trading localized problems for a total global disaster.
And all of this brings the argument right back to the wisdom of Blackstone's ratio. The crucial takeaway from this source text is crystal clear. A state, an institution, or a bilateral alliance is a structural framework. So when you find individual malfeasance within it, the logical, just response is the prosecution and correction of those specific actors. It absolutely does not require and cannot justify burning the entire cooperative framework to the ground.
As you think about how we evaluate global alliances, the analysis leaves us with this heavy, almost cinematic question. It asks us to confront the true cost of demanding a utopian standard in a deeply imperfect world. Do the moral failures of a few individuals justify risking global stability by dismantling foundational architectures? It's a massive question, and it challenges us to look past the emotional rhetoric when the stakes are this incredibly high. Thanks for joining me on this explainer. I really hope this helped structure how you view these complex geopolitical debates.